I don't know how many of you guys watched the Super Bowl last night, probably a good number. I watched it. It was a fantastic game. Yes. But of course, we were very highly attuned to all of the political things because those are the kind of political nerds that we are. RFK Jr. with a big $7 million, actually his super PAC, ad buy with a throwback Kennedy ad. Let's take a listen to that.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy. Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through? A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do?
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy.
American Value 2024 is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
So I think that this was, even though $7 million is a lot of money, obviously, I think this is probably money well spent because, Saagar, there are a whole lot of people who are disgusted with Joe Biden or think that he's way too old. 86%, I think, of voters think he's too old to be president again. People also disgusted with Donald Trump, who is very likely to be a convicted felon by the time the election comes around, looking for some alternative. And it's like, hey, there's a guy with the last name Kennedy, might have heard of before, and he is also running. He is a viable alternative.
It was a genius ad for several reasons. Number one, didn't tell us anything about him. You're not supposed to know anything about him. You're supposed to know that his last name is Kennedy and that there's vote independent, which is another option, which is the major reason that many people are backing him and why they would be interested in his candidacy. Second, as a student of those ads, one of my favorite lines from that song actually is, quote, old enough to know, young enough to do. Now, look, he may be 70 years old, but he's a lot younger, unfortunately, than all of the other people who are in the race. The 78-year-old Donald Trump, if he were to be elected, the 82-year-old Joe Biden, if he were to be reelected. So he's got the, the age, at the very least, comparatively on his side. The Kennedy ad, too, and people are going to see this in our focus group, the ability to evoke the inspiration of that era, especially amongst people who watch their parents really fall like prey to the Kennedy magic, is just, I cannot describe how powerful and emotive that is for the for the older voter, the median voter in this country, 55 years old with no college degree, who can think and talk to their parents about what that time was like and about some of the feelings that they can connect to it. So the nostalgia, the being younger, these are the type of ads that we learn about in our social studies classes, and to be able to connect it back to something like this in a modern age, give people a choice, I thought it was very, very powerful.
I mean, the thing that we've said from the beginning with him is that the more vague he keeps his messaging,
the better it is.
And because he has a lot of, very divisive stances, some of which we talked to the focus group about. Obviously, it's really interesting to hear their reaction to that. But the more that he is just like, associated with the Kennedy brand as sort of a generic alternative to these two dudes that a majority of the country hate and are disgusted by the fact that they only have these two choices, the better for him. I think probably, the bigger obstacle, maybe the largest obstacle for RFK Jr. at this point is just the ballot access, because the way our system is so rigged, it makes it so incredibly difficult to be on the ballot as a viable alternative. But, as a bit of political theater and as a way to get his name in front of the country and get people Googling, like, who is this dude? What is this all about? I thought it was a very, very intelligent move. So we've been really curious about who are the RFK Jr. supporters? What do they look like? What are the different archetypes? And we got a lot of really, really interesting data and insights from the focus group that we were able to do with James Johnson of JLPartners, and he's going to join us in the studio now. Just give us a moment to set up, and we'll get right to that. All right, guys, so we are lucky to have James Johnson of JLPartners here in the studio to tell us what he found noteworthy about the RFK Jr. focus group. Great to see you, sir.
Good to see you, man.
So tell us a little bit about who this group was and your initial impressions.
7 people who said that they are going to vote RFK Jr. in November from the suburbs of Detroit. So key swing state, obviously, in Michigan, and they are people who, at the moment at least, are saying they're going with, many of them for the first time, for a third-party candidate in RFK Jr.
Interesting. We have an initial sort of intro piece of why they feel like RFK Jr. has won their vote over. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
You've all got one thing in common: Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, one by one, I want you to just tell me about your story of where you ended up there.
His announcement was phenomenal. I thought it was one of the best speeches I've heard in a long time. And I thought it addressed something real. I'm hungry for a change, and I want leadership.
I also saw the pitch for his campaign opening, but I was looking at it more toward legacy. and the views that I grew up with. So it was a little bit deeper for me that the Kennedy family would throw a candidate in there that would fulfill what the past Kennedys have and work for all people.
Legacy and the name and for change and for the people, because I do not like, our other potential candidates.
RFK, I smiled when I heard his name. I can just hear my mom talk about and smile every time JFK came up. So I just knew they were a good, supportive, rounded family. He seems very confident in what he talks about. And he's listening to views from other people. I'm not for Biden. I'm definitely not for Trump, but I'm for the people just like RFK is for.
To me, he's a strong person, and he's going to be willing to take on the establishment, to take on the military establishment and some of the entrenched political organizations that are running our country. He's proved himself in his legal profession, standing up to big pharma and doing, work on pollution, environmental issues. He's got his legacy of his family, and some of it's tragic. So good for him for standing up and making a go at it.
I think I was on the internet on Facebook or something, and they put up that he was running, and I was like, dang, that would probably be really cool, to come back like the Bushes, now it's the Kennedys. I think it would be a good idea for him to run at this time when everything is going down. He will probably help the economy a little bit more as far as, because it's basically going down. Even though they saying everything is going up, it's going down. And I just think overall, the person he'll be a good fit.
I didn't actually know about him until a random episode of Joe Rogan. He was on it, and I actually heard about him several times before, but he's mentioned as like a crackpot or whatever. It's really hard to lie for 3 hours straight about yourself to put on a facade. And I look at Trump, I don't really see integrity there. I see manipulation. I look at Biden, I don't even see substance there. I see a guy who is enough of a figurehead that a party can use. And then RFK Jr. just looks like, for the most part, that's a lot of integrity.
That choice that we face in November, looking almost certain now that it's going to be Trump versus Biden, going by the primaries, how does that choice make you feel in one word?
It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Me too, uncomfortable.
Nervous.
I see recklessness with the two of them.
I'm concerned about a fair election.
Continued divisiveness, it's 2 words.
Makes it all feel pointless.
There are some suggestions that the Trump team might have reached out to RFK Jr. about him being his potential vice presidential running mate. How does that make you feel?
That would be a deal breaker for me.
I'm not a fan of Trump. I mean, he's a loose cannon. He's done some horrible things. But if he asked RFK to be his vice president, I would feel like RFK is copping out, like, oh, I guess if I want to get in the White House, this is what I'm going to have to do.
I thought that was a really good political move if Trump was going to do that, frankly. So if he could get him on board, then, he would get his voting base increased substantially.
He would sway me more to accepting Trump because I believe in the integrity that he has.
Put your hand up if it would make you feel better about Trump if he became Trump's vice presidential nominee.
So many interesting things there. One thing that I note in terms of how they explain their support for RFK, there's sort of a few themes. There were a couple who touched on some kind of specific political issues. Yeah, the one gentleman talking about like taking on the entrenched political establishment. But a lot of it was either, I like the Kennedy name, it gives me the warm fuzzies, or I really hate my other 2 options. And this one seems genuine. That was the other thing you heard a lot is like, he seems like he's authentic, he seems like he has integrity, and I don't feel like either of these other 2 dudes do.
I think that's right. We know from our other Breaking Points focus groups and wider polling that people are really dissatisfied about this choice of Biden and Trump.
Yes.
And it seems like, sort of they are yearning for something else and the nostalgia of the Kennedy name, plus things that they really like about Robert F. Kennedy. I think that is important. Yes, Kennedy is playing a role, but the Robert F. is too. They quite like him. Some also said that they liked the fact that he was bucking the trend a little bit with his family name, not just embodying it. And so, they understand that nuance that he's trying to carry. So yes, they like it, and they like that he seems like a breath of fresh air integrity was a word that came up a lot. Honesty was a word that came up a lot.
Yeah, it also was clear to me on that answer with the Trump VP. Like, they don't like Trump. They don't like Biden either. There really was a real independent streak. We were talking a bit before the break. Could you just give us a breakdown of who these people were politically on the spectrum? They're all over the map, as we understand, if you could break it down.
Yeah, so they were basically split into thirds between people who voted for Biden in 2020, Trump in 2020, and a third party in 2020. So this is a really quite diverse group. They were quite a pragmatic group as well. They didn't feel like diehard Democrats or diehard Republicans. You know, they were quite transactional about their vote, and I think that speaks to the fact that RFK Jr. can pull these voters from across the political spectrum because they're so fed up with the status quo.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Speaking of that, one thing that struck me, you asked them a good bit about his vaccine stance and what they think about the vaccines and what they thought about the handling of COVID. And obviously, that's a very divisive stance that RFK has. It's a very divisive issue and has been in America. I was sort of struck by that pragmatism that you had people who had different views there, but they weren't like at each other's throats over it. Let's take a listen to how that part of the conversation went.
RFK Jr. said Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates may have tried to profit from the COVID-19 vaccine. RFK Jr. has also made links between the COVID-19 vaccine and 5G, including that Fauci and Gates suppressed information about other COVID-19 cures, so the vaccine was the only viable option.
I think that RFK did his homework. All they did was follow the money. They were way too involved in the lab in China, and there's nothing more to prove. I mean, it doesn't. Nothing adds up about it.
That's, to me, is speculation. Just like they speculated that, it started in China at this wet market, and it was intentional. And I'm like, how do they know that?
What's your personal views of those vaccines? Were they a net benefit? Were they a net problem?
I was against them. It was such a push on something that was not tested, and it put a lot of people in danger.
I was really against vaccinations until my mother screamed at me that I could not even come to her home unless I was vaccinated because she's older. People with pre-existing conditions, I think it's important to have the vaccinations, available.
I think it's individual. Big corporation can't say, you're either vaccinated, you don't work for us anymore. I think totally wrong.
Well, I've had family members die from COVID. So in the early days, I was definitely pro-vaccination, but I also think it was a personal choice for people. As time has gone on, we're hearing about side effects, more research has been done. Now I feel more comfortable because I know we have treatments that can be used. So you don't just go to the hospital and get on a ventilator and don't come home anymore.
I took one dose and I had a very, very strong negative reaction and didn't take the second one. And then my wife was pregnant at the time, and I couldn't in good faith imagine her taking it at the same time. Like, it was rough. My father died in care after getting COVID. What they did is they induced coma, put him on a ventilator, gave him medications. He died of organ failure. Later that year, his sister, my tia Millie, exact same way. With Trump and with Biden, something like the treatment during that time period, with all the protocols, they're both culpable for how all of that was handled. They would both rather it be dismissed and ignored, and he's the guy who's not. That's a focus, is to address that stuff.
Are politicians telling the truth about COVID?
Well, I don't think Trump was informed. I don't think Biden's being honest, and I think Fauci misled everybody.
Fauci is a politician. He's also has special interests, personal interests in different things going on with the vaccine, with the lab in China, supposedly. But I liked him. Initially I thought, he meant well until you start finding out more information about what's going on.
You have gained notoriety for your skepticism about vaccines. And over the summer in an interview, you said, quote, "There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective." Do you still believe that?
I never said that.
So stop me. We have the clip. Please play the clip.
Play the whole clip.
You've talked about that the media slanders you by calling you an anti-vaxxer. And you've said that you're not anti-vaccine, you're pro-safe vaccine. Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
So you did say it. Do you still believe it?
Well, here's what I would say. First of all, I'm not anti-vaccine.
How is that statement not anti-vaccine?
Well, I can say right now there's no medicine for cancer that's safe and effective. It doesn't mean I'm against all medicines. I've been fighting 40 years to get mercury out of fish. Nobody calls me anti-fish. What I want is vaccines that are proven safety. And what I meant, which was a bad use of words in this, none of the vaccines that are currently on the mandated schedule for children, the 72 vaccines, have ever been tested in a pre-licensing safety study.
How do we feel he came across there? He was defending his position. What do we think?
I think he should say what he really felt on that, and because I think all of us understand any medication. You just want it to be safe. You don't know how it's going to react with you as an individual, looking at the science of it. But he did look a little nervous in trying to clean it up.
He seemed a little uneasy. He said it. He said, I might have used the wrong words.
I'd rather his approach of overcaution than reckless abandon.
If there was another global pandemic, a real problematic new virus, the same issues we talked about are on the table again, vaccines, lockdowns. Put your hand up if you think RFK Jr. would be the best person to lead the country in that situation.
Yeah, he's gonna.
Okay. If there's a situation that, like previously, where they need to get the vaccine out there, I would hope that he wouldn't hold it up too much. He has to weigh that testing element and the safety element up, because if people are dying, it's a lot of pressure.
I'm sure he'll weigh the pros and cons of, how many people it would benefit and wouldn't actually hold up something that would benefit more people than it hurt, but he would pay attention.
I also think that he wouldn't have put all these businesses, make them close. These mom and pops, they could have stayed in business. They could have had safety measures in place rather than just across the board make them close.
So much about that's interesting. First of all, it seems for one, maybe two of them, this is a relatively motivating issue. For most of them, it didn't seem like. I'm curious about your thoughts on that. But for people who are just listening to this and weren't able to actually see the clip, when you're playing to them that CNN clip and the comments from RFK on the Lex Fridman podcast, the faces were very pained, very concerned. They were not enjoying that exchange. And so I found that interesting as well, especially since a lot of the focus group participants seemed like, it was less about his specific stances on the issues. They may not even be aware that he's been sort of leading vanguard of the anti-vax movement for decades at this point. There was more of just Kennedy nostalgia and I want something different. That did raise the question in my mind that if more of this was played, if there was more sort of oppositional ads against him, et cetera, that you may actually move some of these people off of him if they had more awareness of what his positions were. What did you think of that?
Yeah, three things came across from that for me. The first is that I think certainly there is a bit of it's not their most important issue in terms of, they're not necessarily going to turn away from RFK Jr. because of it. But I do think we need to remember that these are people who RFK Jr. already has. These are sort of his 10% or so in the polls at the moment. If he wants to grow that base, then that could be a problem, even though these guys are pretty much okay with it. I think the second point is that the thing they didn't like about the clip was not so much the substance, but something we always see in these focus groups, which was this sense that he was being a bit of a classic politician. He was dodging the answer.
Weasley.
Exactly, and that is exactly why they like RFK Jr., because they don't think he's like that.
Yes.
So if they see clips like that, so if I was, the Biden or Trump campaign, I'd be compiling clips of him looking like a politician rather than, the populist sort of, sort of favourite that they currently see him as. The third thing, and I think this is important, I think this is what these focus groups let us see, is that you hear a lot about how RFK Jr. supporters are, they're crazy, they're cranky, they're conspiracy theorists. These people's views on the vaccine, people listening and viewing might not necessarily agree with them all, but they were reasoned from personal experience positions to take. And I just think that is
they
that
were
reminder.
talking about like Bill Gates and microchips and stuff like that. They're saying, listen, I think everybody should have a choice. You know, people who say, look, net benefit, you know, I was very for it in the beginning, especially I lost loved ones because of COVID. That jumped down at me as well, because that was one of my questions going into the focus group was, how much are these like people who have a diehard commitment to this issue or another issue that RFK has championed, and how much are they just, you know, people who are looking for an alternative to two really shitty choices at this point? And by and large, I think it's the latter.
The latter jumped out at me too. James, give us a taste of some of the, we're gonna keep debuting clips and all of these other things. What were some other moments that really jumped out to you that were really noteworthy that our audience can look for and pick up on?
I think the big one, and on that subject of what are the deal breaker issues, is RFK Jr.'s position on Israel. They broadly knew that he was very pro-Israel, and for a lot of them that did not coincide with their views. They were more of the view that perhaps the Israeli response had been a little bit too disproportionate, that they felt that that America shouldn't be involved in funding Israel or indeed Ukraine. So that was an interesting example of where, you know, views rubbed up against there. The interesting thing there that was, though, they would rather RFK Jr. just let his views be known and say, agree with me if you want to, disagree with me if you don't, because rather than, you know, him try and fudge a position on his actual views. So that's the lesson for RFK Jr. on this. You are running as an insurgent. You are running as the anti-politician. Make sure that you continue to be that. You saw him trying to get that across in that Super Bowl ad. And I think if we'd have, you know, the people who went and focus grouped that Super Bowl ad, they could have done it from our focus group, because the messages they were looking for were exactly the same. Leaning in on the brand and leaning in on independence. Someone new in the field rather than the old politicians.
Brand, nostalgia. It's not political. It's more of a rejection of the existing choice. Vote independent being very strong.
My last question for you, James, which may be a difficult one to answer, but I'm just curious as a pollster what your thoughts on this are. There's a lot of debate about who RFK, quote unquote, takes more votes from, right? Some of his issues code more right wing on vaccines, on Ukraine, on quote unquote cancel culture. And early on, his favorability was higher with Republicans than it was with Democrats. I think that continues to be the case. However, he's a Kennedy. And when you actually look at the polling that comes out, it kind of seems like a wash which candidate he helps or hurts the most, and it kind of varies poll to poll. So do you have a sense, after talking to these individuals, whether Biden or Trump should be more concerned about an RFK Jr. candidacy?
I think it's both of them. Our most recent national poll showed that it was exactly the same proportion coming from both Trump and Biden. And when you look at the voters he can grow into, it's also both. Who would I, you know, if you really had to push me, who would I say would be most concerned? I would say Biden, and that's just because he's got slightly lower approval ratings than Donald Trump.
And weaker supporters, like weaker support. Trump people freaking love the guy. Biden people are like, he's fine, I
think
guess.
that's it. And this, you know, he's the disenchantment candidate, RFK Jr., and therefore the candidate who people are most disenchanted by has the most to lose.
That's a really smart point. It's about negative polarization for a lot of Biden support, so that can be split very much with RFK. Anyway, James, you did a fantastic job, as always. We really appreciate you, JLPartners, and all this for doing this with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Disenchantment candidate. I think that's, I like that phrase. I'm going to steal that one. Great to see you, James.
Thanks so much, guys.
Hey, guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.